My name is Lorraine Becker. I am 70, 2 years old, on Christmas Eve. In front of the whole family. My daughter-in-law picked up the old wooden box I'd brought, turned it over in her manicured hands like she was checking the bottom of a shoe, and set it down on the pile of torn wrapping paper headed for the trash. "Cheap gifts don't belong here," she said. And she said it for the little phone propped up on the mantel filming her perfect Christmas. Not for me. A few people did that uneasy laugh. The one that isn't sure it's allowed. I didn't argue. I didn't say a word. I stood up, walked over, lifted that box back off the trash pile, brushed a curl of ribbon off the lid, and tucked it under my arm. I told them good night. I wished them a Merry Christmas. And I drove home alone through the snow with my husband's whole heart riding on the seat beside me. A few hours later, there was a knock at my door. And it was my son. Hatless in a blizzard, shaking so hard he could barely get the words out. "Mom," he said. "Mom, please." Was Dad's letter still inside? I brought him in out of the cold, and I sat him down at my kitchen table, where that old wooden box was sitting right out in the open, safe as a sleeping child. And I asked him, gentle as I could, "Why do you ask me that?" "Danny, because here is what my daughter-in-law called cheap and threw on the garbage pile on Christmas Eve in front of everyone we love. And here is exactly what happened when that family finally understood what was hidden in the bottom of it. Welcome back to Calm Mom Revenge, where the gift somebody calls cheap is almost always the only thing in the room that money could never have bought. Stay with me to the very end of this one, because the end is where it all comes together. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if these stories mean something to you, go on and subscribe. My name is Lorraine Becker. I'm 72 years old. And for 46 years, my husband and I ran a little wood shop on the edge of a town called Millbrook. A shop with a hand-painted sign that just said Becker Woodworks, where Roy built furniture that will outlast every one of us, and I did the finishing and kept the books and learned to tell, just by running my thumb along a joint. Exactly what a thing was worth? I want to tell you a little about wood before I tell you the rest. Because if you don't understand the wood, you won't understand the man. And if you don't understand the man, you won't understand why I did what I did. There are two ways to know what something is worth. One way is fast. You look at the label. You look at the brand. You look at the price. And you call it good. The other way is slow. You turn the thing over. You look at how it's put together. Whether the corners are joined or just glued and stapled. Whether somebody took the extra hour, nobody would ever see. You look underneath. Roy taught me that the worth of a thing almost always lives in the part you have to go looking for. The dovetails on the inside of a drawer. The maker's mark burned into the bottom. The part that doesn't show. Anybody can finish the front. Lorraine. He used to tell me, you find out who built it by looking underneath. My hands aren't what they used to be. 46 years of sanding and steel wool and turpentine. And the arthritis came for my knuckles about 7 years back. Slow, and then all at once. There are mornings now, I can't hold a brush until I've soaked my hands in warm water and talked some sense into them. I don't tell you that for pity. I tell you so you understand what it cost a woman with hands like mine to spend 3 months restoring that old box. And why I did it anyway. And why I wouldn't take back a single hour. People see a woman my age, and they see something soft and finished. A sweet old thing with reading glasses on a chain. Easy to talk over, and easier to ignore. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that. And for a long while, I let her. Because I learned a long time ago that being underestimated is the quietest kind of advantage a woman ever gets. But I spent a lifetime learning the difference between what a thing costs and what a thing is worth. And the night my son stood shaking on my porch in the snow, I knew his wife had finally learned that difference. The hardest way there is, let me take you back to where this really begins. Because it doesn't begin on Christmas Eve. It begins with Roy. My husband passed 11 months before that Christmas. 46 years of marriage. And then a long autumn of doctors. And then a quiet morning in a hospital room. And then a house that was suddenly far too big. With the workshop out back gone silent for the first time in half a century, Roy Becker was not a loud man. He drove the same truck for 18 years and wore the same canvas work coat until the cuffs frayed. And when they frayed, I patched them. And he was prouder of those patches than of anything he ever owned. New. He was the kind of man who'd notice the kid sweeping up at the lumberyard looked hungry and find a reason to send him home with the good end cuts and a 20 for his trouble. And never mention it again. Roy didn't think in money. Roy thought in years. He thought about the man who'd sit in the chair after the man who bought it was gone. You don't build for the fella standing in the shop today. Lorraine, he'd say, planing a board smooth. He could have left rough. You build for whoever's sitting in it 50 years from now. When you're not around to apologize for the work. Roy wanted to be a grandfather more than he ever wanted anything on this earth. And we waited a long, hard time for it. Danny, our only child, married late. To Courtney. And a baby was a long time coming after that. Roy used to talk about it out in the workshop with the radio playing low. The little stool he'd build, just the right height. The way he'd teach those small hands to hold a chisel. The trouble the two of them would get into that I'd have to put a stop to. He'd earned that trouble. He just didn't quite get to have it. Our grandson was still only a soft rumor. A due date on the calendar. When Roy's heart finally set down its tools for good. But here is the thing about a man who thinks in years. He'd been getting ready to be a grandfather for the better part of 30 years before there was ever a grandchild to get ready for. And he'd built the proof of it with his own 2 hands and hidden it right where it belonged, in the part you have to know to look for. About 2 weeks before Roy died, when we'd both stopped pretending, he asked me to go out to the workshop and bring in the box. I knew the one he meant. It had sat on the shelf above his bench for as long as I'd known him, a plain little wooden box. Walnut gone dark with age and handling. About the size of a bread loaf. With a lid that fit so perfectly you could feel the air push back when you closed it. I'd dusted that box 1,000 times. I figured it held screws. Or old keys. Or the kind of nothing a man keeps in a box on a shelf. I brought it to him. And he set it on the blanket over his knees. And he did something I'd never once seen him do in 46 years. He pressed a spot on the inside back corner. And slid a panel I never knew was there. And the bottom of that box came up in 2 pieces. A false bottom. He'd built a false bottom into it the year we got married. And in all that time, he had never told me. Underneath was a roll of soft gray flannel. And when he unrolled it on the blanket, there were coins. Gold coins. Each one in its own little paper sleeve. Lined up in a row. I started the year Danny was born. He said. And his voice was thin now, but his eyes were clear as glass. Bought one every year on his birthday. Didn't matter if it was a good year or a lean one. I found the money for the 1 coin. Some years that was the hardest dollar I spent. He smiled at me. The old Roy smile. The one I married him for. 31 of them now. They're worth a good deal more than I paid. Last I checked. The lot of it comes to a little over $60,000. And tucked in beside the flannel roll was his wedding band, which he'd taken off when his hands got too thin to keep it on. And a sealed envelope. And on the front of the envelope, in his blocky carpenter's pencil, it said, "For my grandchild. To be opened on your 18th birthday." I asked him why he'd never told me. He took my hand. "Because you'd have worried over it." And worried it into a bank. And a bank's just a number on a screen. He tapped the box. "This is a thing a child can hold. A thing they have to go looking inside of. I want our grandbaby to grow up knowing their granddad built them something with his hands and hid a fortune in the bottom of it, where you'd never find it unless you knew to look underneath. Then he told me the part that mattered more than the gold. The part I think about every single day since, don't just hand it over. Lorraine, make them find the false bottom. Don't tell them it's there. Let them go looking. A thing you find is a thing you keep. Make it last. Make them find the false bottom. That was very nearly the last clear instruction my husband ever gave me. And I meant to honor it down to the grain. So in the months after we buried him, I took that box out to the workshop and I restored it. Partly for the baby. And partly, I'll be honest, to give my hands something to do besides shake at 3 a.m. in a house that had gone too quiet. I stripped the old finish down with my own swollen hands. A little each day. The way Roy taught me. I steamed out the dents the years had put in it. I rubbed it with oil until the walnut came alive again. Dark and warm and deep as a creek bed in shade. And on the bottom, where Roy had long ago burned his maker's mark, I traced over the 2 small letters with the tip of my finger more times than I can count. R. B. Roy Becker. So a piece of him would be in that child's room for every Christmas and every birthday and every storm. Long after I was gone, too. It took me 3 months. My hands made me pay for it. But when it was done, it was, I'll say without false modesty, the finest thing those hands ever brought back to life. And then I did the real work. I laid Roy's letter inside the false bottom, and his wedding band beside it, and I rolled the 31 gold coins back into their flannel and set them in, and I closed up the hidden bottom exactly the way he'd shown me. So smooth and so true that you would press every inch of that box and never once feel the seam. A little over $60,000 and a dying man's last words sealed into the bottom of a thing a young woman was about to call cheap. Now I have to tell you about Courtney, my daughter-in-law, because I don't want you thinking she's just a cartoon. She's more than that. And the more is the sad part. And you ought to have it before you judge her too hard. Courtney grew up the only daughter of a woman named Sharon, and Sharon keeps the receipt for everything, in her purse and in her heart. I met Sharon a handful of times before the wedding, and every single time she found a way to tell me what something cost: the dress, the venue, the ring, the neighborhood. Courtney was raised from the cradle to believe that the worth of a thing is the number printed on its tag, and that the worst thing that can ever happen to a woman is to be caught with something common. So Courtney curates, and here is the bitter little irony at the heart of this whole story. The one Roy would have shaken his head at. Courtney loves Christmas, loves it the way you love a brand. Her tree is professionally flocked and lit in a single coordinated color, and she has a different theme every year that she plans in July. Her gifts come from luxury catalogs, wrapped by a service, stacked for the camera. She films all of it for the thousands of people who follow her perfect life online. She adores the idea of a cozy, heartfelt, old-fashioned Christmas. What she cannot abide, what frightens her, right down to her toes, is the actual thing, because the actual thing comes worn and handmade and without a logo, and it doesn't match the palette. And it might make her look common in front of the camera. The cruelest joke about people raised the way Courtney was raised is that they cannot recognize something genuinely precious when it's sitting right in their lap, because it didn't come with a price they could read out loud. She was about to prove it on Christmas Eve, with a phone running, in front of every person she was trying to impress. She just had no idea what she was holding when she did. And I have to tell you about my son, Danny. Because the part of this that still keeps me up at night isn't Courtney. It's him. Danny is a good man who has spent his whole life going around a fight the way water goes around a stone. He's gentle. He's funny. He worshipped his father. And he fell hard for Courtney. And somewhere in the falling he went quiet. Agreeing. Smoothing. Keeping the peace. Because the peace was easier. And Danny has always taken the easier road. When Courtney and her mother redecorated his whole life in trends and price tags, Danny just went along. It was easier. After Roy died, Danny came apart, the way the quiet ones do, where it won't trouble anybody. He'd call me late and talk about his dad. He kept Roy's old steel tape measure clipped to his belt. Even working a desk job that never needed it, he of all people knew exactly who his father was. Which is why, when the truth finally came out, it didn't break Courtney. Courtney deflected. It broke Danny. Because Danny was standing right there on Christmas Eve. Danny watched his wife call his dead father's handmade gift cheap and set it on the trash pile. And Danny, keeping the peace, taking the easier road, said nothing. Did the nervous little laugh? He didn't know what was inside. And I'll be fair to him about that. To my last breath, he didn't know. But he knew his daddy made that box. He knew his grieving mother had spent her winter restoring it with hands that don't hardly work anymore. And he let it go onto the garbage pile to keep from making a scene. That's the thing he's going to carry. And it isn't Courtney's cruelty. It's his own silence. Hold on to that. Because we're coming back to it. The Christmas Eve invitation came as a digital card, animated, with snow falling across a photograph of Courtney's flocked tree. Becker Family Christmas, a curated evening. It said, and there was a dress code. For a family Christmas. Which told me everything. I didn't mind. God help me. I was glad. I had the most important gift in the world, wrapped in plain craft paper on my kitchen table. And I had practiced in my head exactly how it would go. The baby's first Christmas, little Royce, had come in October. 7 pounds of red-faced fury with his grandfather's exact scowl. Courtney had named him Royce because it tested well. She said, because it sounded expensive. I never had the heart to tell her it was 1 letter off from Roy. I'd practiced it 100 times. I would hand Danny the box. And I'd say, gentle. There's more to this than it looks. Son, your father built it. Press the back corner. Inside. And Danny would find the false bottom, and the coins, and the letter in his father's hand. And the whole room would go silent. And everyone would finally understand that the quiet old woodworker who couldn't be there had been building for this baby for 30 years. Make them find the false bottom. Roy had said, I was going to let my son find the false bottom. I drove over through the first real snow of the year with that craft paper box on the seat where Roy used to ride. And I talked to him a little on the way I still do. Big night. Roy, I said, we're giving Danny the box. Royce's first Christmas. Can you believe it? We got to be grandparents after all. I had no idea on God's earth that I was about to watch a stranger set my husband down on a pile of garbage. Courtney's house glowed like the cover of a magazine. The flocked tree, white this year, lit all in cold blue. Not one ornament out of place. A tablescape. She called it. That cost more than it would ever feed. A mountain of gifts wrapped in matching paper. Arranged by size. A little phone up on the mantel on a stand. Its red light on. Filming the whole curated evening for her page. I felt like a wren that had flown in through a door left open. Everyone was younger and glossier than me. In clothes that knew they were being photographed. I held my plain craft package in my lap and found a chair near the edge, where the old aunt is meant to sit. And I smiled. And I waited. But I wasn't unhappy. I had my secret. And a secret keeps you warm on a cold night. Roy's brother Pete was there. 69 and sharp and warm. The one other person in that room who'd loved my husband down to the ground. He squeezed in beside me partway through. Curated evening. He muttered. When we were boys, we got an orange and a pocket knife and thought we were rich. I laughed. And he nodded at my package. That the box Roy told me what he kept in the bottom of that thing? You know, showed me once. Years back. Swore me to secrecy. He winked. That baby's the luckiest little man in this county, and he can't even hold his own head up yet. I had no idea, none that Pete's knowing, and his assuming everyone in that family knew too, was about to be the match that lit this whole thing. You ought to tell Danny before he opens it, Pete whispered. About what's in the bottom. So he's careful. But I shook my head. Smiling. Roy's orders, I said. Make them find the false bottom. Let Danny find it himself. I'll show him the corner after. Pete chuckled and shook his head. He always did love to make a man go looking. My brother. I think about that little exchange more than almost any other moment in this whole story. Because if I had stood up right then and told that room there was over $60,000 in gold and Roy's last letter built into the bottom of that box, none of what came next would have happened. Courtney would have handled it like the crown jewels. There'd have been no story to tell you. But I didn't. Because I was honoring a dying man's wish. And because, I will be honest with you, it never crossed my mind in 1,000 years that any living soul would call a handmade box cheap and set it on the trash. Set it aside politely. Maybe. Forget to ooh over it. But on Christmas Eve, with a camera running in front of the whole family, that was a failure of imagination on my part. I'd lived 72 years and never met cruelty quite that comfortable with itself. I didn't know to brace for it. Courtney ran the gift opening like a broadcast. She sat under the cold blue tree and handed gifts around and made everyone hold them up for the phone and say what they were. The grown-ups exchanged things with logos on the bags. Each one admired, photographed, narrated. The money in that room was loud, and I didn't have a dime of it. And I didn't care. Because I had something none of them could have dreamed of. Wrapped in brown paper on my knees. At last there were just 2 gifts left under the tree, a flat envelope from somebody, and my plain craft box with its bit of red string. Sharon picked mine up and read the tag. From Grandma Lorraine, she announced. In that dripping, gentle voice you'd use for a child's crayon drawing. A couple of people went awe. A phone came up. Courtney took the box, gave the brown paper one quick assessing look. And the corner of her mouth did something I didn't care for one bit. Let's see what Grandma brought, she said. And she pulled the paper off. And for one moment, one single moment I let myself hope, the craft paper fell away. And there it was, Roy's walnut. Dark and warm and alive again, under 3 months of my ruined hands. His maker's mark hidden on the bottom like a held breath. In that cold blue glossy room, full of things stamped out in factories, that box looked, to my old eyes, like the only honest thing in the building. Courtney turned it over once, the way you'd check a thrift store find for a chip, and I watched her face. I watched her see that it was old, and handmade, and plain, and I watched her decide what that meant. Her nose did a small thing. The little flinch of a woman taught from birth that old and handmade are just polite words for cheap. Oh, she said. Is this? Like. From the garage, Danny's father made it. Honey, I said. Varm. And I leaned forward to start telling her. There's something more to it. Press the back corner. But Courtney was already talking over me. To the room. To the camera. That's so sweet, she said, in the exact voice you use to end a conversation. And then she looked around at her perfect, curated evening, her color-coordinated mountain of gifts, her glowing little phone. And I watched her do the math, the social arithmetic of a woman who lives for an audience. A scuffed old wooden box did not fit the picture. It did not match the palette. And there was a camera running and a brand to protect. There was a big open trash bag at the end of the room, half full of torn wrapping paper and flattened gift boxes, waiting to go out to the bins. Courtney stood up, my husband's box in her hand, and crossed to it. "Okay. So, I love Grandma," she said, laughing, playing it up for the phone. "But I have a whole aesthetic for the house. And honestly," and she set Roy's box down right on top of the garbage. Gentle. Like it was exactly where it belonged. Cheap gifts don't belong here, and there it sat. My husband's walnut, his maker's mark, his 31 years of birthday gold, his wedding band, his last letter to the grandson he never got to hold, sitting on a pile of torn Christmas paper headed for the curb. And the room laughed. Not everybody, but enough. That nervous follow-the-leader laugh of people who've decided the one with the camera is the one being funny. The phone on the mantel caught all of it. Sharon clapped, delighted, and my son, my Danny, stood by the tree. Went pale, opened his mouth, and closed it again. He said nothing. That was the worst second of the whole night. Not the box on the trash. My son's mouth closing. Cheap gifts don't belong here. I've heard plenty of unkind things in 72 years. I've been called old-fashioned, behind the times. A sweet little nobody with her woodshop and her reading glasses. None of it ever landed the way those 5 words landed. On Christmas Eve, with my husband's whole heart sitting on a garbage pile. Here is what I need you to understand about that moment, because it's the hinge the whole thing turns on. I had a choice. I could have stood up and let that room have it. I could have said, "You foolish, frightened girl. Do you have the first idea what you just said on the trash? There is $60,000 in that box, and the last letter your son's grandfather ever wrote, and I could have made a scene they'd still be talking about at funerals." And part of me, the part that was Roy's wife, and that baby's grandmother, and a woman whose ruined hands had brought that walnut back to life. Part of me wanted to, badly, but I didn't. Because in that one breath, I did the math. And it came out the same 3 ways. The first, the gold and the letter were sealed in the false bottom. And Courtney hadn't found them. And she never would. Because she didn't even know to look underneath. The second, a camera was running, and her cruelty was being recorded by her own phone. Which meant the truth would keep just fine without any help from me. And the third, and this is the one that decided it, I looked at that smug, performing, frightened young woman. And I understood that the worst thing I could possibly do to her was not make a scene. It was to let her have this moment whole, and hand her the truth later. When there was no camera, and no audience, and no way on earth left to pretend she hadn't known. So I did the only thing that had any dignity left in it. I stood up, quiet, and I crossed that room. And I lifted my husband's box up off the garbage and tucked it under my arm where it belonged. If you've ever stood in a room full of people and watched something made with love get treated like trash, had your hours, your effort, your whole heart set aside because it didn't come with the right name on it, then you know the particular silence that follows. The silence of deciding how much of yourself you're willing to defend in front of people who already decided you weren't worth much. If that silence is familiar to you, stay right here with me. This is where it turns. I held the box against my side, and I brushed a scrap of ribbon off the lid. Calm as you please. The room had gone quiet now. The laugh had curdled. Even Courtney seemed to feel she'd misjudged the wind. And she covered it bright and fast. "Oh, did you want to keep it? That's fine." "Totally fine. It's all right, dear," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "It isn't really your taste. I'll hold on to it." And that steadiness, I watched it land on her. And it bothered her a great deal more than shouting would have. She'd braced for tears. Or a tantrum. The only two things her world had ever taught her to handle. A calm old woman tucking a box under her arm and saying, "I'll hold on to it," did not compute. "I believe I'll head home before this snow gets worse," I said to the room. "Gentle. Thank you for having me. Merry Christmas. All of you. Merry Christmas. Danny." I caught Pete's eye, gave him a small nod, and I picked up my coat and my husband's box, and I walked out into the snow with my back as straight as I could hold it. I didn't cry until I reached the car. In the car, with the door shut and the snow coming down soft on the windshield and that glowing house in my mirror, I let myself fall apart for exactly as long as it took to feel it all the way through. I held the box in my lap. There was still a thin line of cranberry sauce on one corner from the trash pile, and somehow that was the thing that undid me, that Roy's walnut. His 30 years of patient love had spent 2 minutes on a garbage heap because a young woman thought it would look good on her page. "I'm sorry. Roy," I whispered to the dark. I should have just told them. I should have protected it better. But here is the strange thing about grief and clarity. They can ride in the same car through the same snow. By the time my tears ran out, something underneath them had gone very calm and very certain. The way a workshop goes quiet and still when you finally shut the machines off at the end of a long day, and you can hear yourself think, "I was not going to give Courtney that gold. Not like this. Not into the hands of a woman who'd call a hand-built box cheap on camera." Roy's last wish had been, make it last. Make them find it. Make it mean something, and you cannot hand a legacy to someone who sets legacies on the trash for content. But the baby, little Royce, who hadn't done a single thing, who was innocent of all of it, that baby still deserved his grandfather's gift. And that was not up for discussion. Roy built it for the child, not for the child's mother. So somewhere on that snowy drive home, I went quiet and certain, and I started, for the first time in months, to think like a woman who'd kept a business's books for 46 years. Not about how to make a scene, about how to make this last exactly the way Roy asked. In a way nobody could ever set on the garbage again. I'd been home maybe 20 minutes. The box on the kitchen table and the kettle just starting to sing, when headlights swept across my front window, too fast for the snow. A truck door slammed, and then my son was pounding on my door. No coat. No hat. Snow in his hair. Shaking from the cold, and from something a great deal worse than cold. I learned afterward exactly what had happened in those 20 minutes. And I'll tell it to you the way Danny told me. Because you ought to see it from his side, too. He'd been standing by that tree. He said, in the awful seconds after the box went onto the trash, fighting the urge to cross the room and snatch it back and losing the fight. Because Courtney was laughing and the phone was filming and making a scene would have ruined her whole evening. So he swallowed it. Told himself it was just an old box. Told himself he'd smooth it over with me later. The old reflex. Take the easier road. And then, after I'd gone, his Uncle Pete had come and stood beside him, shaken, and said the words, "Your daddy's gold. Danny. 30 years of it." And his last letter, built into the bottom of that box, just like Roy wanted. Danny said it was like the floor dropped out from under him. He turned and looked at the trash bag, and Courtney, ever efficient, had already tied it off and carried it out to the bins in the cold. For one horrible minute, Danny thought it was gone. Truly gone. That his mother, hurt past speaking, had either left it on the garbage or driven off and thrown it in a ditch. And that his father's last words and his son's whole inheritance were sitting in a snowbank in a tied-off trash bag on Christmas Eve. And that he had stood there and let it happen. And laughed. He couldn't look at Courtney. He couldn't speak to her. He grabbed his keys and walked out into the storm and drove to the only person who'd know, the woman whose husband built the box, his mother. praying I had it, terrified I didn't. Mom. His voice broke clean in half on the one word, there on my snowy porch. Mom. Please. Was Dad's letter still inside? Please tell me you have the box. Please tell me you didn't. I have it. Sweetheart, I said, and I took his cold arm and pulled him in out of the storm. It's right there on the kitchen table. It's safe. His letter's safe. Come in before you freeze. I watched him see it, sitting there on the table in the lamplight, whole and warm and dark. And he made a sound like a man coming up out of deep water. And he crossed the kitchen and put both his hands flat on that box like he needed to feel that it was real. Mom, what was inside it? He asked, when he could talk. And there it was. The question the whole night had been driving toward. My son. Dripping snow on my kitchen floor. Asking what his wife had said on the trash. I could have softened it. I could have spared him. But Danny was 35 years old, and a father now, and there are some things a man needs to hear in full. Because the weight of them is the whole point. Your father's wedding band. I said, gentle, and 31 gold coins. One for every birthday of yours. That he bought a little at a time for the better part of 30 years. They're worth a little over $60,000 now. I let that sit a second. And his letter? Danny. The last one. The one he wrote for Royce to open on his 18th birthday, so a boy who's never going to meet his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway. Your father built a false bottom into that box the year we married. And that's where he kept it all. And that's what you watched your wife set on the garbage tonight. The kitchen went very, very quiet. And then my son, my gentle. Peacekeeping. Easier road son sat down hard in a kitchen chair and put his face in his hands and made a sound I had not heard from him since he was a small boy. Araf. Helpless. Breaking sound. I didn't stop her. Mom? He said into his hands. I was standing right there and I didn't stop her. I laughed. I let him cry. Sometimes that is the whole job of being a mother. You let them cry. And you don't rush it. And you don't fix it too fast. I kept telling myself it was just a box. He said, when he could. That's what I told myself standing there. It's just an old box. Don't make a thing of it. And it was Dad. Mom. It was everything Dad and his voice gave out. I'm going to hear that sound for the rest of my life. How are you so calm? He asked me finally, wiping his face like a boy. How are you not? I'd understand if you never spoke to either of us again. Because I have it. Danny. I told him, because your father's gift is safe on my table. And that baby is going to get every coin of it and every word of that letter. Nothing precious was actually lost tonight. Only a few illusions. And those needed losing anyway. I paused. And because calm is the only weapon I've ever found that the people who threw it away can't argue with. He was quiet, a long moment, looking at the box. Then he said, what do you want to do? Tell me what you want. Mom. And I'll do it. For once in my marriage, I'll do the right thing instead of the easy one. And there it was. The first real backbone I'd heard in my son's voice in more years than I could count. It had cost him this much to find it. Maybe it always does. I want one thing. I told him, I want everybody at my table tomorrow. Christmas dinner. Here. My house. Your aunt and uncle. Courtney. Sharon if she'll come. And I want to give Royce his grandfather's gift properly. Out loud. Where everyone can see exactly what it is and exactly what almost happened to it. I let it land. Roy said make them find the false bottom. So tomorrow, we're going to find the false bottom together. Just a little later than I planned. Danny told Courtney that night. When he got home. He had to. He couldn't lie down beside her holding something that size. I wasn't there, but I heard about it afterward from both of them. And the two versions tell you everything you need to know about the two people who told them. In Danny's telling, he sat her down, still shaking, and told her there had been over $60,000 and his father's last letter built into the bottom of the box she'd set on the trash on camera. And Courtney's first words, her very first words, were not, "Oh my God," or "Is it gone?" or "What have I done?" Her first words were, "Well, how was I supposed to know that? Who hides money in a junk box and doesn't say anything? That's not even normal. Honestly, this is kind of on her for not telling me." That sentence is the whole of Courtney. I'm afraid. Caught doing something unforgivable. Her instinct wasn't sorrow. It was defense. To go find the angle where she was the one who'd been wronged. She had set a dead man's life's work on the garbage. And inside of a minute she'd built herself a version where the real villain was the grieving widow who hadn't labeled the box properly. When I heard Courtney's own telling, lighter, it was that she'd been ambushed and humiliated over an honest mistake. And that nobody understands the pressure of hosting. Not once. In any telling. By anyone. Did Courtney say the words "I'm sorry" and mean them? I want you to hold on to that. Because it matters for what I decided. I did not lock that gold away to be cruel. I locked it away because a woman who answers setting your husband's heart on the trash with "honestly, this is kind of on her," is not a woman you hand an open inheritance to and walk off whistling. So the next morning, before anyone came, I made some calls of my own. With my reading glasses on and Roy's box open on the kitchen table. I'd spent 46 years being good with my hands and quietly good with a ledger. And now I put both to work. I reached the lawyer in town that Roy had used. A kind, careful man who answered his phone on Christmas morning when I told him whose widow I was. And before the day was out, we had the shape of it. The gold or the money, if it were ever sold, would go into a custodial trust for Royce. And Royce alone. For his schooling. His start in life. Administered independently. It could not be spent. Or borrowed against. Or touched by his mother. Or his father. Or his grandmother, or anyone else drawing breath. The child's, and only the child's. Exactly the way Roy meant it. It cost me something to lock Danny out of it too. And I won't pretend it didn't. But Roy's wish was for the grandbaby. And the cleanest way to honor a wish is to make it impossible to bend. Then I did the other thing. The more important thing, I made a Christmas dinner. I put a roast in at noon and I made the rolls. Roy loved and the house filled up with the smell of it. Because the sharpest thing you can ever hand some people is a warm plate and a steady voice. And I decided that at that dinner, in front of everyone, I was going to do exactly what Roy asked. I was going to make them find the false bottom. This time, the right way. They came in the early dark of Christmas Day. Snow still on their coats. Danny, gray and quiet, carrying the baby in his seat. Courtney, polished again. Vare, looking around my old farmhouse kitchen like she was pricing the cabinets. Sharon, who came because missing it would have looked worse than showing up. Pete, who came early to help me and to stand at my shoulder like the brother Roy would have wanted there. I'd set the table nice. And in the center, where you'd put a centerpiece, I'd set the box, whole and dark and beautiful in the candlelight. Roy's maker's mark hidden underneath. Courtney's eyes went straight to it the moment she walked in. And her face did something complicated. She hadn't expected to ever see it again. I think she'd hoped it would just quietly disappear. The way uncomfortable things always had for her. Handled by somebody else. Out of the frame. We ate first. I insisted on it. You don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach. And I wanted everyone fed and settled and unable to claim later they'd been ambushed. We talked about the baby. It was almost pleasant. Courtney even thanked me for the roast and looked a little surprised to find she meant it. Then I cleared the plates and sat back down. And I laid my hand flat on the lid of the box. I'd like to give Royce his gift from his grandfather now, I said, properly. This time, the way Roy asked me to. Before he died. The table went still. Danny's jaw tightened. Sharon set down her wine. Courtney went carefully. Perfectly blank. Courtney, I said. And my voice was warm and steady and not unkind. Which somehow always makes these things worse. Last night, you held this box. And you decided what it was worth. And you set it on the trash. I'd like to show you. And everyone here. What you were actually holding. And I turned the box over in my hands. And I pressed the spot in the back corner the way Roy showed me. And I slid the false bottom open in front of all of them. Slow. Deliberate. And I lifted out the flannel roll. And I unrolled it on the clean tablecloth. And I laid those 31 gold coins out in a row the way a jeweler lays out stones on velvet. Which is just about what I was doing. These, I said, are gold coins. Your father bought one every year on your birthday. Danny, for 31 years. Starting the year you were born. Some years it was the hardest dollar he spent. They come to a little over $60,000 now. The number went around that table like a draft under the door. Sharon's mouth came open. Courtney had gone very pale. And this? I said, setting his worn wedding band down beside the coins. Is your father's wedding ring. He took it off when his hands got too thin to keep it on. And he wanted Royce to have it. I touched the last thing. The envelope. Gentle. The way you set down a sleeping child. And this is the last letter your husband's father ever wrote. Danny. He dictated it to me in that hospital. It's for Royce to open on his 18th birthday. So a boy who is never going to meet his grandfather can sit down someday and hear from him anyway. I looked up. And I looked directly at Courtney. And I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever kept it. This is what you held in your hands last night. Over $60,000. A man's wedding ring. And his last words to his grandson. This is what you called cheap. This is what you set on the garbage. On Christmas Eve. With a camera running. In front of the whole family. Because it didn't match your house. Nobody breathed. That little phone video, I knew, was still out there in the world somewhere. And every soul at that table knew it too. Courtney did what Courtney does. She reached straight for the version where she was the victim. You can't put this on me, she said, her voice climbing. How was I supposed to know who hides gold in a junk box and doesn't tell anyone? That's a setup. That's basically a setup. You let me, I didn't let you do anything. Courtney, I said, still calm. Your husband's father asked, with nearly his last breath, that the gift be hidden in something handmade, so it would be treasured instead of spent. So a child would have to go looking for it and keep it. I honored him. I assumed foolishly. I'll grant you that no one alive would call a hand-built box cheap and set it on the trash. That assumption was my only mistake here. The setting it on the garbage was entirely yours. It was a joke. She said, it was for the video. I know. I said, gentle. That's rather the whole problem. Isn't it? I folded my hands on the table. Cheap gifts don't belong here. You said. You told the whole room. So, you took the only priceless thing you were given this Christmas. And you set it on the garbage. Because it didn't come with a logo. And because the camera was running. And because you have been taught your entire life that the worth of a thing is the number on its tag. You let it land. There's no price sticker on a man's last words. Courtney, There's no brand on 30 years of a father finding the hardest dollar of the year, so his grandbaby would have something to hold. You couldn't see it, because no one ever taught you how to look underneath. And it nearly cost your own son his grandfather's letter. Sharon started in then now. That's hardly fair. Courtney didn't, and I turned my eyes to her. Just once. Sharon. I said. You taught her how to look. I'd sit this one out. Sharon sat it out. Then I told them what I decided. Because mercy and consequence can sit at the very same table. And I raised Danny to know the difference. Here's what happens now. I said. Royce gets every coin. Roy saved it for the baby. And the baby will have it. I laid my hand on the row of gold. But not the way it was meant to be given. I can't hand an open inheritance to a household that sets a man's legacy on the trash for a video. So, this is going into a locked trust. Administered independently. For Royce, and Royce alone for his schooling. His start. It cannot be sold. Or borrowed against. Or touched by his parents. Not by Courtney. Not by you. Danny. Not by me. Danny nodded slowly. And I saw, with a small ache, that he understood that the locking out included him, and that he didn't argue, because he knew he'd earned it standing pale and silent by that tree. And the box? I said, comes home with me tonight. Royce can have it when I'm certain it'll be honored. And not one day before. A thing isn't safe in a house that never knew it was precious. Courtney opened her mouth to say something about the box. I think. Which tells you she still hadn't understood a single word, and Danny, my quiet son, finally spoke. Courtney. Just her name. But in a voice I had never once heard him use with her. Don't. Not one more word. Not about the box. Not about whose fault it is. Not one more word tonight. And Courtney, for the first time since I'd known her, closed her mouth and kept it closed. It had taken over $60,000 and a dead man's letter to give my son a backbone. But there it was. Late is still better than never. There was one thing left. The most important thing. The thing Roy actually wanted. His letter to Royce is for the boy's 18th birthday. I said, and it'll wait. Sealed. In the trust. Until then. But Roy had written one small part for all of us too. A few lines for the day the family first learned about the gift. And he made me promise to read them out loud when that day came. He didn't know it would be a day like this one. But here we were. I took a second. Smaller envelope from my cardigan pocket. And I opened it. And my hands shook not from the arthritis this time, and I read my husband's words to his family. In my kitchen. On Christmas Day. With his grandson asleep in his son's arms. If you're hearing this, I read. Then the little one finally got here. And I'm sorry I'm not there to spoil him and get sawdust on everything and drive his mother crazy. I built this box the year I married Lorraine. And I've been filling the bottom of it for 30 years. Because the best thing my own father ever gave me wasn't money. It was the knowing that he'd been thinking of me. Putting a little aside. Long before I could ever thank him for it. That's what's in the bottom of this box. Little one. Proof you were wanted by an old man who never got to meet you. Who found the hardest dollar of every year just to put something away for you. Use it for something that lasts. And whatever you do, you'll be the kind of family that knows what a thing is worth. Not just what it cost. Your grandmother knows the difference better than anybody alive. Learn it from her. Every chance you get. Merry Christmas. Son. All my love. Grandpa Roy. My voice broke on his name. And I lit it. The kitchen was dead silent. Pete had his hand over his eyes. Danny had his face pressed down to the top of his sleeping son's head. His shoulders shaking. And Courtney was looking at that plain old box on the table. the one she'd set on the trash. And for the first time, I think, actually seeing it. It was too late to be forgiveness, but it might, just might, have been the very beginning of learning how to look. I folded the letter back into its envelope. The hard part was done, and I am not a cruel woman. So I softened. The way you let a room breathe after a hard truth has been spoken in it. I didn't do this to humiliate you. Courtney, I said. Though I know it feels that way, I did it because that baby is going to grow up in your house, learning your values. And someday, he's going to need to know there was another way to measure things. The gold is for his future. The letter is for his heart. And the box I rested my hand on the warm walnut lid is just to remind everyone in this room, myself included, that the most precious thing in any room is almost never the most expensive one. Then I looked at my son. Danny. I said, you stood quiet last night because quiet was easier. You've stood quiet your whole life because it was easier. I'm not angry with you, but I need you to hear me as your mother. This box made it home because I refused to be quiet about what it was worth, even when staying quiet would have been so much more comfortable for me. That's the inheritance. Son. Not the gold. That. He nodded. He couldn't speak. He didn't need to. I'm Royce's grandmother. I said then. To the whole table. Not optional. Not some thrift store relative you tolerate at the holidays. My husband built that baby a box with his own hands and hid his whole heart in the bottom of it. And I will be in that child's life. Fully. Or this family and I are going to have a much harder conversation than this one. Those are my terms. Nobody argued with the terms. Here is how it all shook out in the months after Presley and Warnate. Because I know you want the ledger and not just the feeling. The trust is locked. And it's growing. Over $60,000 in gold. Sitting quietly. Doing for Royce exactly what Roy intended. Waiting. Passion. The way Roy himself would have. The boy can't touch it until he's grown. And neither can anybody else. And that's the whole point. Roy thought in years. So now does his grandson's future. That little phone video, the one of Courtney setting the box on the trash and saying cheap gifts don't belong here, turned out to have been seen by a great many more people than Courtney realized. She'd posted it herself. As a cute Christmas moment. Before any of us knew what was inside. And she took it down the day Danny told her the truth. But the internet keeps what you give it. And here is the part Roy really would have appreciated. Courtney's whole brand was cozy. Heartfelt. Old-fashioned Christmas. So when word got around her own circle that the warm and homespun Christmas lady had called her own son's handmade heirloom cheap and set it on the garbage for a laugh, well, she spent a long, quiet season being known. In the exact world she'd built. As the woman who threw her child's inheritance on the trash for content. I didn't do that to her. She filmed it herself. There's a lesson in that too. Somewhere. About living your whole life for a camera. Sharon and I are not close. We never will be. But she has stopped telling me what things cost. Which I count as a small diplomatic victory. Courtney and I are careful with each other. She has never once fully apologized. She isn't built for it. And I've made my peace with that. But she came out to my workshop a few weeks later. In a small voice I'd never heard her use. And asked me if I would show her how to refinish a little stool she'd found. For Royce. I said yes. We sanded it down together. And her hands got dirty for the first time in her life. And we rubbed oil into it until the grain came up. And when she saw what was under all those years of scuffs, she went quiet in a way I'd never seen. She kept that stool. She didn't replace it with something from a catalog. It's a start. You have to start somewhere. Danny is the one who changed the most. Grief and shame did to him what 35 years of comfort never could. They grew him a backbone. He came out to my workshop about a month after that Christmas. Alone. And stood where his father used to stand. And he said, "I've been replaying it. Mum, Christmas Eve. And I keep landing on the same thing. I didn't fail Dad when I let the box go on the trash. I failed him 100 times before that. Every time I stayed quiet to keep her happy, the box was just the one I couldn't unsee. That's a hard thing to know about yourself." I told him, "You knew it about me for years." He said, "Why didn't you ever say something? Because some things a man has to find for himself." I told him, "I could have told you 1,000 times. Son, it took a box on the trash to make you believe it. He's different now. He speaks up. He and Courtney are in counseling, which I never thought I'd live to see. He still keeps his father's tape measure clipped to his belt. But now he's told me he's going to set up a little bench in his own garage and teach Royce to build something with his hands, the way his granddad would have. I'm still learning how not to take the easy road. Mom," he told me, "but I'm choosing the hard one on purpose now. That's new, and I'm proud of him for it. Late is still better than never." The box lives on a shelf in Royce's room now. It took a few months long enough for me to be sure the house it was going into had learned, even a little, what it was holding. When I finally brought it over, Courtney had cleared a place of honor for it. Up where the baby could see it but not reach it. She didn't say one word about her palette. She just watched me set Roy's walnut on the shelf. And she ran one finger along the bottom, over the 2 small letters burned into it. And she said, "Quiet. R.B." I never even noticed that was there. Most people don't. I said, "You have to know to look underneath." My hands are worse this winter. Some mornings the swelling wins and I can't hold a brush at all. But I'm building Royce something out in the workshop. Slow. A little on the good days, a small stool. Just the right height. The kind Roy always meant to make. With his grandfather's initials burned into the underside, where the boy will find them someday. If he knows to look. Because that's what we do. The ones who work with our hands. We hide ourselves in the bottoms of things. Quiet. And then we wait. Roy taught me that. You build for the man who'll sit in the chair after you're gone. If there's one thing I'd hand you out of this whole story, it's this. The world is going to tell you, louder every year, that worth is something you can read right off a label, that the expensive gift is the real one, and the handmade thing is sweet but lesser, and the precious things all announce themselves. Don't you believe a word of it? The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones built by hand, given without a logo, worn soft with use, easy to set on the trash if nobody ever taught you how to look. Worth doesn't sit up on top where you can see it. Friend. Most of the time, it's hidden in the bottom. Under the part everyone judges. So look underneath. And whatever it is you love in this life, build it into something that lasts and never, ever let anybody tell you it belongs on the garbage. That's my story. One old wooden box. One Christmas Eve. One trash pile. And a love worth more than the whole curated evening put together. If it reminded you of a handmade thing you still treasure, or of the person whose hands made it, go and tell them while you still can. Leave a comment and tell me about them. Hit subscribe if you'll stay for the next one. And I'll see you then. Merry Christmas. Wood remembers the hands that shaped it, even when the room forgets to respect them. Every smooth corner of that box carried Roy's patience. Every hidden joint carried his discipline. And every quiet inch of walnut held a love that had been built slowly. One birthday at a time. Courtney looked at the surface and saw something old. Roy looked at the same wood and saw a grandson he might never meet. A future he could still touch. and a place to hide proof that the child had been wanted long before he could understand it. A false bottom is not only a secret compartment. Sometimes it is a test of how deeply people are willing to look before they judge. Those who live by labels will miss the maker's mark. Those who perform kindness for a camera may never learn the weight of quiet devotion. But a family worth keeping is one that learns to turn the box over. Look underneath. And honor the love hidden there before it has to be rescued from the trash. Scriptwriter Nguyen Van Chien.